So also a brief hello from me. I'm Carlos, and I will have a brief introduction to your talk and to both of you. And many thanks to Petra as well for sending me an update on what I am planning to say. So I think I'll not talk longer than 3 or 4 minutes and then hand over to you. And you'll have around, I think, 45, 50 minutes, and then there's room for discussion.
Sounds great. Thank you.
But once we start, I and most of the others will both mute and turn our cameras off, so people don't get distracted from the main event.
Okay.
Right, it'll be the same with me. Once I'm through with the introduction, I'll turn off my camera. So
Sounds great. That's just fine. And Petra, you'll just remind me when to advance the slides. I'll do my best. But
yeah. No, that's fine.
Okay.
So usually I think it's quite fine to wait 1 or 2 minutes and then to start with the introduction.
Okay.
At least according to my computer, we should start right away if we would do it the German way.
That's the fun of being an international group, Carlos.
Right, yeah.
We don't do things together. But we don't do them the French way either.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, is there time? What's time? No, time for a coffee.
Right.
Yeah. I lived in Italy for a year, and we learned to invite our friends for a time that was about an hour before we really wanted them. That seemed to balance things out.
Absolutely, the Italians are wonderful at that. Turning up for 9:30 starts and finding nobody in the room at all is very, very common. Okay, I'm going to not log off. I'm going to turn my microphone and camera off now.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm not really sure. Probably a few people might also drop in within the next couple of minutes, but since I think your talk is far more important than my introduction, I would already start, and I'd like to welcome everyone who has joined this webinar. AFINet started this series of webinars in October 2020, and if I count it right, this is webinar number 15 already, and we will continue to have these webinars. And of course, I would like, first of all, to say a big thank you to Richard Wellerman, who is responsible for keeping things going, but also to Alex Helfer, Sari Jurvansu, and Emmy Kaupila, who are responsible for all the technical details, so for all these things working. And I also would like to recall that our webinars are open to everyone, and but of course organizing the webinars also is associated with some costs, so we would be grateful for everyone who has got the ability to give a small donation to AFINet, since we are a small charity organization, and information can be found on the website. So today's theme will be bereaved mothers' use of media advocacy in advancing drug policy reform in Canada. And the talk will be held by Heather Morris and Petra Schulz. Heather Morris is a PhD candidate in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta and also a registered nurse. She graduated with a Bachelor of Nursing from the University of Manitoba in '91 and her Master of Nursing from the University of Alberta in 1997. Since that time, she has had the opportunity to work on a number of different research projects, pertaining to prenatal care, substance use, and harm reduction. And as a former public health nurse, her current research interests center around public health advocacy and how individuals with lived experience, bereaved mothers in particular, shape drug policy reform in Canada. Heather is a board member with the Alberta Public Health Association and Alberta Alliance who educate and advocate responsibly. Petra Schulz lost her 25-year-old son, Danny, to accidental fentanyl poisoning in 2014. She's one of the co-founders of Moms Stop the Harm, a network of Canadian families impacted by substance use-related harms and death. Through the lessons learned from her personal experience and by sharing Danny's story, Petra has become an advocate for drug policy reform to reduce the harm associated with substance use. She believes that substance use is a matter involving human rights and health and must not be criminalized. And I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. And of course, if there are some questions coming up during the talk, you can write them in the chat. And after the talk, there'll be room for discussion. So I'll hand over to you, and I don't know who of you both will start. So the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you so much. And it's Heather here, and thank you for inviting us today. I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging that both Petra and I are located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. As you know, my name is Heather. I'm a registered nurse, a PhD candidate in the School of Public Health here at the U of A, and I'm working under the supervision of Dr. Elaine Hishka and also Dr. Cam Wild. And as has just been discussed, my area of research is on bereaved mothers' use of media in advancing drug policy reform. So over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, Petra and I hope to share with you some of what we've learned in the last 5 years. An important part of my own personal training has been through volunteer with the Streetworks Van, which is a harm reduction outreach program here in Edmonton. And as has already been said, I'm also a board member with Alberta Public Health Association and AWARE, which is an organization which represents the needs of people who use drugs. But where I've learned the most about advocacy is through my research collaboration during the course of my PhD studies with two organizations which represent families directly impacted by substance use, Mums Do and Mums Stop the Harm. I've just been incredibly fortunate to work so closely with both of these organizations, and you'll understand why when you hear from Petra in a few moments. Oh, yes. Okay, so in terms of the presentation outline, what we plan to do in the next 45 minutes or so, we'll begin with remembering and honoring loved ones lost to failed drug policy. And from there, we're going to talk to you and give you a little bit of a background in terms of Canada's drug poisoning crisis. After that, we want to describe the work undertaken by Mums Stop the Harm in advocating for drug policy reform, and also their work in offering mutual support. And then finally, we'll report on the research project exploring the experience of mothers who have lost a child to substance use who have been engaged with the media.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Heather. My story, when I share my story, it starts with my son, Danny. Danny, as said earlier, was 25 years old when he died from accidental fentanyl poisoning in 2014. Actually, this is what I call my sad months, the months of April. On April 30th is the anniversary of the day he died. On May 1st, the anniversary of the day when we found him in his apartment. Danny was in recovery at the time when he bought one more pill, which he thought was what was sold as street oxy, which was usually heroin pressed in the form of an OxyContin after the actual pharmaceutical wasn't available in the street anymore. But that was when fentanyl was emerging, unbeknownst to Danny. And what he took, as we learned later from toxicology, was just pure fentanyl. So he was home alone, and there was no way he could have known how to dose his substance that was so much stronger than what he expected. After Danny died, we had really difficult decisions to make, and one of the most difficult decisions was what to say about his situation. And our middle child studied classics at the time, and I said to him, what does it mean to give a eulogy? And he said, eulogy, loosely translated, means speaking well of someone. And it was clear to us that if you speak well of someone, you don't tell lies. So we shared the truth about his situation, and which we had hidden before, like so many families do. And everyone was surprised. His work, our friends and neighbors, our family, most family members didn't know. People at our church, everywhere people came forward who were facing the same situation, which to me showed that we were not alone, but also this is a huge problem and we are not talking about it. A little bit about Danny is Danny was the youngest. He was always a bit of a quirky child. When he was 3, he wanted a cactus for his birthday. When he was 14 in Canada, you can get your learner's permit to drive at 14. When he was 14, he wanted an old Chevrolet Chevette that he saved up for and bought. And then subsequently drove, and he had many old cars. In junior high, he wanted to pan for gold on the river here and see if he finds riches. But as a teenager, he also developed difficulties. Danny struggled with social anxiety, very severe social anxiety. And one time when I asked him why he took drugs, he said, if I take one of those pills, I can walk into any room and be who I am, which really drove it home to me that a lot of people take drugs to heal or treat underlying pain. Danny also came out being gay, and while he was raised in an accepting family, and an accepting church, he faced some bullying in high school and from circles of friends, as we learned later. And Danny lived with a learning disability, which meant that his executive function ability, he had challenges with that, and he had difficulty controlling his impulses and predicting the consequences of his actions. All aspects that put him at a higher risk of substance use, but also a higher risk of suffering an overdose, as he eventually did. After Danny died, I started reaching out to media as well as openly sharing his story at the funeral. And through these media connections, I connected with other members of Mom Stop the Harm. And next slide, please. And what I learned is that substance use and overdose can really affect anyone, but it affects some people disproportionately. As you see in this slide, these are some of our early members of our group. If you just look at the photos and see what you notice, people are young, people are dying who are in their 20s, 30s, early 40s, mostly men. Here in Canada, about 80% of those who die are men. And while in these pictures, the people you see are mostly white, the statistics that we have is that Indigenous people in our province are 7 times more likely to die from an overdose. In the next province to our west in British Columbia, five times more likely. And we know that Afro-Caribbean and Black people are at a much higher rate of overdose deaths or drug poisoning death, and also incarceration. Next slide, please. A bit of on statistics in Canada. In 2014, when Danny died, there wasn't any national record keeping. When the current Liberal government came to power, they started national record keeping. The pressure from advocates and also medical officers of health, we just didn't have the number. So they started in January 2016, and the numbers we have for most provinces go up to September 2021. And we almost have 27,000 apparent opioid toxicity deaths. If we go to the end of 2021, it will probably be 27 or 28,000. Most die in the provinces of British Columbia. I'm in Alberta, in the west and by the Rocky Mountains. For those of you who maybe had a chance to travel here before COVID. Yeah, Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario are the hardest hit regions. And most of those, as I said, are young males. There's also a high rate of hospitalizations. These are just people actually make it to hospitals. If you look at number of ambulance calls, that is staggering, even more staggering. And you can find this detailed information on the Government of Canada website linked here on the slides. And we can share, we're happy to share a PDF of these slides after our talk. Next slide, please, Heather. Here you see a map of Canada. The colors, the dark purple is rates per 100,000, 20 or higher, and they should really change their scale, because as you see, I give Alberta as an example. Alberta is way above 30, as is British Columbia and many others. The Yukon, a small territory to the north, is incredibly hard hit. And the white spots are not full of snow, but they just don't keep any numbers, which I think is a travesty. We should at least keep a record of what we have so we know what to do. Next slide, please. These are numbers from our province of Alberta. If you see, before 2012, the numbers were always kind of in the 100. But then in 2012, fentanyl emerged after OxyContin was reformulated. To me, an example of failed government policy, of revising policy without consulting people who are most affected. And then you see the numbers going up and up and up until 2018. And in 2019, they went down a little, and you may ask why. And we had a government that was more favorable to evidence drug policy. It's sort of a social democratic in the European perspective. And they implemented a lot of harm reduction measures, made naloxone, the antidote to overdose, widely available, and they also created supervised consumption sites. And that had an impact on the numbers, which we're very, very thankful for. But then in 2020, two things happened. One, COVID, or I'm sure you call it Corona in most European countries. So Corona emerged, and with it, public health measures that meant people were more isolated. The programs that they depended on were closed, and people were also struggling more with mental health and turning to drugs probably in higher numbers. But here in Alberta, we also had a conservative government that started what I would say is a war on harm reduction. They closed consumption sites, they cut harm reduction programs and initiatives, and pushing for abstinence-based treatment, which for opioid use disorder is not what the science tells us to use. So as an end result, last year we had an absolute staggering, almost 1,800 people die, and yet no effective action from our government. And in other provinces, the increase was as staggering in 2021 as it was in Alberta. Next slide, please, Heather. As I said earlier, after Danny's death, I started reaching out to media, and through media articles, I connected with these two ladies. Here holding the black and white photo is Leslie McBain. She's from Pender Island, BC, but originally from Edmonton. She lost her her beautiful son to accidental fentanyl poisoning. And holding the color picture is Lorna Thomas. Her son Alex died from substance use related suicide. So the three of us, we started in 2016, we met in 2015, formally started in 2016, and now have over 3,500 families Canada-wide. And our mission is to advocate to end substance use related stigma, harms, and death. Please note, we don't advocate to end substance use because humans have used substances for as long as we have existed. I did have a strong cup of black tea this morning, which I needed, which is a really good stimulant for me. Next slide, please. What Mom Stop the Harm does, we engage in advocacy and in peer support. Here you see us marching on International Overdose Awareness Day, August 31, in my home city of Edmonton. We organized a march and a rally, and the photo with the cookies, that was pre-COVID. Our grief support group got together before Christmas to decorate cookies to take to a supervised consumption site, which sadly since has been closed by our government. Next slide, please, Heather. We have two types of support groups. One are our Healing Heart groups. They are for families who have lost a loved one. And our Holding Hope groups are for families with loved ones using substances. We have these groups across the country, of course, not in every city. So what we have started, especially during COVID, is offer groups on Zoom as well. And our approach is not, people might be familiar with Narcotics Anonymous family support groups. Our groups are very different. We don't believe in tough love. I personally, I don't believe in the concept of codependence, and organizationally we don't support that. We believe in providing loving support while setting healthy boundaries to keep everyone as safe as possible. But we strongly believe in harm reduction and empowering families to provide harm reduction supports as much as possible. We generously receive funding from the Government of Canada and the Government of British Columbia for these programs. Next slide, please. In terms of our advocacy, is the number one issue we advocate for is a safe, regulated supply. A safe, regulated supply means providing regulated alternatives to toxic street drugs. There was a lot of talk around overprescribing being the root cause of the overdose crisis. While overprescribing contributed to more people using it, actually did not contribute to more people dying in the way that the toxic market does. So right now in Alberta, over 90% of all deaths are attributed to toxic street supply. In the rest of Canada, it is over 80%. So we feel providing altitude to people who use, not to the kid down the street at the corner store, of course, but to people who use to provide safe, regulated alternatives, we see as the single most important measure to stop the death. Together with that, we also call for the decriminalization of people who use drugs. Nothing criminalizes like a criminal record. Nothing stigmatizes like a criminal record, I should say. And it means that people hide their use, and so many people hide and use alone, and then they're like, for my son Danny, then there's nobody there to help if a person should have an overdose. We want to push for harm reduction in all provinces. It's unequally available because our health system is provincial. So every province kind of gets to do what each sees is right, and that often means that there are no evidence-based services. And we also push for evidence-based treatment. While abstinence-based treatment is a choice that should be available to people, we need to have a range of services that are evidence-based. And as I said earlier, for opioid use disorder, the gold standard would be medically assisted treatment with Suboxone, methadone, Cadian, or similar medications. And of course, we need to work on upstream prevention. I don't know how much it makes the international news, but here in Canada, we had residential schools to which we send Indigenous children in an effort to eradicate their cultures. And many of these children suffered, or all of these children suffered horrendous abuses in residential schools. And as a result, you have generations that did not grow up in caring and loving families, but rather in these horrible places. And people self-medicate to a high degree. So to address and to provide prevention, we have to deal with the trauma that arose from those residential schools, but also we have to deal with other underlying issues such as poverty, people not having homes, and providing good and effective and early treatment for mental health, which is woefully underfunded in Canada, as I'm sure it is in most European countries. And what we call for is that in everything we need to see the meaningful inclusion of people who use drugs and their families. Nothing about us without us is what people who use drugs say, and we as families say the same. The reformulation of OxyContin without consultation and the subsequent emergence of fentanyl really shows how wrong things can go. Next slide, please. I was fortunate, together with Heather and our principal investigators, to participate in a research project. And in my opinion, any research project worth its name needs to have a knowledge translation project. We need to take this research and make it useful to people. And what we did after our research on mothers' advocacy, we created a set of 4 videos. You see the links here, they're free to use. I encourage you to watch them. We used to share them after in our talks, but they are so powerful that at the end result, it's usually silence. People need to process what they see. Here, 4 of us wrote letters to our children, and we read the letters, and then the letters are read back to us as a camera is pointed on us. When the project was first proposed, I needed time to digest it. It was one of the single most important but most difficult things that I've done with advocacy projects. Please watch Phil if you only watch one. Phil is the dad of Alex, who died by suicide, and it's so important to hear from men. With so many young men dying, we need to hear from fathers. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. We're here to talk about our media work, and as I said, it is through media that I reached out to Leslie and Donna, up top is the article that Leslie's brother sent her, and that's how Leslie and I connected. Leslie's brother lives here in Edmonton, and he said, Danny's story just sounds just like Jordan's. That article was really instrumental in connecting me with Leslie and also with Lorna. Then underneath, we have an article in one of the largest national newspapers about our advocacy. In the middle, the same newspaper in 2020 featured 100 people who had died due to drug poisoning, most of them during COVID. And now we have a lot of media reaching out to us for help when they write stories. And many of those, I would say about 1/3 of the people featured are Mom Stop the Harm members. And on the right, a recent article, a local journalist did. We work hard to find journalistic allies. And one of those allies wrote a series of articles, including what is happening across neighborhoods. And this picture is one of our Mom Stop the Harm members showing a photo of her daughter, and this mom, she's now raising her daughter's young son. Yeah, next slide. Mm-hmm. And I'm handing it off to Heather at this point.
Okay, thank you so much, Petra. So, as Petra mentioned, in Canada, bereaved parents and family members have very much been at the forefront of public discussions on this urgent public health issue of the drug poisoning crisis. And in sharing their personal stories, they're challenging the stigma of substance use and addiction. They're also contributing a much needed family perspective to public understandings of substance use. So parents are working to draw attention to the national overdose crisis and trying to influence drug policy change through a variety of efforts. They've been meeting with politicians at all levels of government, lots of public speaking engagement, also engaging with the media as well too. But while research and policy initiatives have recently included people who use substances, the experience of parents and families has historically not been included. And this is a real problem because, as we all know, family members are greatly impacted by their loved one's substance use. They're oftentimes the primary support, and they also offer a unique lived experience that can inform program planning, policy making, and research in substance use. So in June of 2016, our team of university researchers embarked on an engaged scholarship project with members of Mums Stop the Harm, represented here by Petra Schulz of Edmonton, Mums Do, represented by Donna May of Toronto, and the Voice of the Family, represented by Jennifer Woodside of Vancouver. So these are 3 Canadian parent advocacy organizations representing families who have been directly impacted by substance use. The university researchers, myself and my PhD supervisor, Dr. Elaine Hishka from the University of Alberta, Dr. Emily Jenkins from the School of Nursing at UBC in Vancouver, and Dr. Rebecca Haynes-Saw from the University of Calgary. Now, Jennifer Woodside and Donna May have both since retired from advocacy work, but we remain in touch with both of them in terms of our studies progress. And one thing I just want to reemphasize for all of you is that these 3 organizations are quite unique in their commitment for advocating for a public health approach to substance use, which is inclusive of a harm reduction philosophy and inclusive of harm reduction interventions. And as many of us know, not all family organizations support such an approach. So we started this process, as all of us do, by delving into the existing literature. Much of what I said before is much of this existing literature relates to the advocacy of people who use drugs, currently use drugs or have used drugs in the past. So there was quite a bit of literature featuring Vandu, which is out of Vancouver. There's published literature on how mothers have advocated for policy changes based on their experience of mothering a child with a disability or childhood cancer, HIV/AIDS, and children who identify as being part of the LGBTQ community. Most of these studies, however, have focused on advocacy work at an individual level, so that is mothers advocating for their own child, as opposed to mothers advocating at a population level and trying to change policy. Arguably, probably the most well-known example of mothers advocacy work at a population level is that of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD. Very highly visible grassroots organization. I'm sure you've all heard of them. They advocate for family victim support, stricter penalties, and legislative changes around impaired driving. And research has shown their work to have been particularly successful in reducing alcohol-related traffic deaths, both in the US and in Canada. Now, while MAD's efforts appear to bear a close resemblance to the work that Mums Do and Mums Stop the Harm do, there are 2 major distinctions. The first one is that the parents working with MAD have oftentimes lost their child at the hands of another person, versus parents within Mums Do or Mums Stop the Harm. Their child having died of drug poisoning, oftentimes the families are blamed by society, or the child is blamed by society. So there's a tremendous amount of stigma, as we all know, that surrounds this. The second issue is that MADS focuses on victim services and protecting the public from one of the harms associated with substance use, that is impaired driving, while parents associated with Mums Stop the Harm and Mums Do are working to counteract stigma associated with illegal drug use. Not blaming the individual who used, but instead advocating for the prevention, treatment, and in many cases, like I've said before, harm reduction approaches to supporting people who use drugs. I just want to highlight a couple other areas of literature that we have delved into. The one of them here, it has to do with family members and their experiences of grief following the substance-related death of a loved one. And advocacy in these papers is sometimes referred to in this literature, but rarely is there a specific discussion in terms of how the media is leveraged to advance drug policy reform. And then the second one is the communication literature. These two studies, the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, have been really important because of the fact that they've demonstrated that public support for harm reduction interventions can increase when a sympathetic narrative delivered by a bereaved mother is paired with factual information, as well as refuting common misconceptions about harm reduction interventions. So I'd encourage you to take a look at any of those studies. The primary research study which our team undertook is entitled Mothers' Stories of Advocacy Following Their Child's Substance Passing. And our two primary objectives have been to advance academic knowledge on parents as advocates for drug policy reform, and then secondly, to help build parent advocates within their own capacity within their own organizations to achieve evidence-based policy responses in Canada. We sought out and received ethical approval from the University of Alberta, USC, UBC. We also used a community participatory approach to examining mother stories of advocacy. So Petra, Donna, and Jennifer were closely involved in both the planning and the execution of the project at all stages. They assisted with reviewing and revising the study protocol and its attachments for submission to the 3 research ethics boards. They provided really important feedback to us in terms of what language should be used, what questions we should ask, and as well as what issues might arise during the interviews themselves. They recruited all of our study participants by way of distributing the letter of invitation to their members through email lists and social media avenues. And Petra has also been very much involved in all the presentations and publications that arise from this study as well too. We define substance-related we define a substance-related loss as any death associated with the use of substances. So that could be a drug poisoning or overdose. It could be substance-related suicide, or it could be physical complications and loss of life related to substance use. We took a narrative approach. We interviewed 43 mothers across Canada between June and November 2017. We also conducted 3 oral history interviews with the founders of these organizations. The length of the interviews ranged from 26 minutes to just over 2 hours. Interviews were recorded and transcribed verbatim. We offered a $50 gift card as an honorarium to the participants that we interviewed. The questions that we asked were quite wide-ranging. We wanted to know what actions and activities are you engaged in? We wanted to know what is the purpose of this work? What is the message that you're trying to convey? What motivates you to do this? We wanted to know what are some of the barriers and facilitators to advocacy, your experience with the media, perceived impact in terms of this advocacy work. And we also wanted to know how the role of motherhood plays into advocacy as well. So we use thematic analysis as described by Braun and Clark, and in Vivo 12 for data management. The participants' responses to our broad code, which is labeled media, is what we are presenting here today. So we went to work trying to answer the following question. How do mothers who've lost a child to substance use describe their experience of media advocacy to advance harm reduction and other drug policy reforms? And these findings and a more detailed discussion can be found in our manuscript, which is published in Social Science and Medicine, Qualitative Research in Health, which is featured at the top of the screen here. In analyzing our sample of 43 participants across Canada, You can see here some of the characteristics in the box at the bottom there. 75% of those reporting their age between 45 to 64. 51% were married. In terms of the amount of time spent in advocacy, we've got a bit of a range here from 30%, 6 to 11 months, all the way up to about 25% having advocated for over 2 years. Most of the children who have passed away are male. Children ranged in age from 17 to 43. Most of them were in their 20s at the time of their death. And the majority of mothers identified that their child died of drug overdose or poisoning, many self-reporting at the time of the interview that fentanyl was the cause of death. Over half the mothers that we spoke to had participated in a media interview themselves as part of their advocacy. And the two most salient themes, which I want to talk about, are, first of all, the news media as allies, and secondly, some of the challenges and personal costs of engaging in the news media. Overall, the women that we spoke to highlighted the critical role that the media plays in their advocacy work. Many, in fact, referred to the news media as one of their most important allies in carrying out advocacy. The news media was seen as having a role in educating the public, in changing attitudes by shaping and driving culture, and in turn, influencing policy. Thus, forging relationships with the media was seen as being absolutely essential. I'm going to read some of the quotes that are featured on the next few slides, but just keep in mind that these are all pseudonyms when you see a name. So Freya states here, it's important that they are on our team and that they don't become jaded. And Hope said that there are some people in the media who've just been amazing in their support. They tell our stories over and over and give us a voice. They believe in what we do, and they do an important job informing the public. This last quote here, let's see, this is from Olivia. She says, they have the power to change public opinion, to change the language, to reduce stigma through their lens of what happens. The mothers that we spoke to reflected on the reasons for engaging with the news media as well too, and many discussed the news media's role in educating the public about harm reduction, the poison drug supply, community resources, and the family experience of supporting someone struggling with substance use. So Hope expressed the following when reflecting on how the news media amplifies mothers' voices. She said, it's incredibly important because it's our way to get our story out. We don't have any advertising budget. You know, I can't drop a few million for TV ads, but if the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or Global, which is the national news network, will give me a few seconds at 6 o'clock in the evening, that's worth a big chunk of change that I don't have to pay for. So the media has been huge in terms of giving us a voice, uncovering facts, reporting the numbers, and sharing individual stories over and over. Additional reasons for engaging with the media include opening space for conversations around substance use, and subsequently reducing stigma and contributing to framing the story of substance use and substance-related deaths themselves, as opposed to leaving it to the journalists to do that on their behalf. Many believe that engagement with the news media also had the potential to influence politicians. Sophie explained that the importance of the news media as a political tool was really important, and she spent quite a bit of time writing letters to politicians. But then she said to us, quote, it really wasn't until I went to the media that I got the health minister to sit down with me because he knew he was going to meet me at a press conference. Evelyn shared the following when speaking of her frustration regarding the lack of provincial and federal responses thus far. She said, I'll be the first one to shame them, politicians in the news, but I'll be the first one to give accolades where accolades are due. So it's holding them accountable, and unfortunately, that is the only way to get government to move. So I've learned that the hard way, and I have the media partners, I have the media presence. Our family, unfortunately, has become the face of fentanyl, and so we will use that to move forward and try as best as we can to get things moving quickly enough, because people are dying every single day. Mothers also spoke at length about the challenges and the personal costs that accompany engagement with the news media. And such challenges included the sensationalistic aspects of news reporting, which was not only applied to people who use drugs, but their family members as well. A fear of having one's story taken out of context, a focus on shocking or graphic details, or stories which centered almost exclusively on the heartbreak of death over drug policy changes made some participants very hesitant to engage with the media. Edith expressed that such stories could increase stigma or add fuel to the fire. So she said here, and so when I see media like that, I think it's just crap, and I don't see how it could have a positive impact. I think it further substantiates the public's impressions, which is these people that use drugs by choice, they should just stop. Some participants expressed that they felt pressured to cry or show emotion, like Mandy, who told a journalist, "I'm not your reality show. I'm here because I want to give you facts and information about how you can save your child." Participants spoke extensively about their disappointment in stigmatizing language or images that appeared in the news. While some spoke about a personal fear that the media would become complacent in their reporting on the overdose crisis, others mentioned instances of being interviewed for a story that never made it to air or wasn't published. Others were fearful that their story would be misrepresented. Finally, while many participants described working with journalists who were caring and compassionate, some had to contend with insensitive comments from journalists themselves or members of the public. Isla reached out to a journal after her daughter's death, but was rebuffed, stating, "She told me that I think it's an epidemic because it happened to me." The most hurtful comments, however, came from trolls who occasionally posted derogatory comments about people who use drugs and their families in response to online news media stories. This not only had the potential to create trauma for our research participants, but also a sense of ambivalence, knowing that such comments had the potential to reinforce harmful stereotypes. Cindy was so grateful that the news agency that she worked with had an official policy to refrain from allowing such online comments. And she said, "I think it could have sent me down a path, and not a very good path, to see that. Because believe me, most of these mums, they've already blamed themselves for every single thing that they could blame themselves for. But the bottom line is we love our children. We've tried our best. We did what we could do with what we had, or what we knew at the time." Mothers we spoke to understood the need to retain a certain degree of power in a relationship that could be potentially fraught with inequity. And so listed here are a number of the strategies that bereaved mothers told us about that they were using when they engaged with members of the media. The strategy that was mentioned the most often was clear messaging on policy or practice solutions. Other strategies included pivoting to your key message, holding news media accountable for their mistakes, and preparing talking points ahead of time. Petra has done countless interviews over the years, and so she can certainly speak to some of these strategies. She certainly has taught me a lot about how to be interviewed effectively and work with the media. To summarize, the majority of the mothers that we spoke to felt that the news media have been a critical ally in their advocacy work. In addition to documenting the reasons for why engaging with the media is important, we also discovered a number of personal costs or risks that were encountered by the bereaved mothers that we spoke to as they attempted to shift the discourse away from their personal grief experience and towards wider structural solutions to the drug poisoning crisis. Our findings have led us to think really critically about the representation of families and people who use drugs in the media. Recent academic and community critiques, some of you may have seen, have highlighted how North American media have excluded racialized and marginalized people, instead choosing to focus on the impact that the overdose crisis has had on white and middle upper class communities. Most of our own research participants self-identified as white and middle class, which likely made it easier for them to garner news media attention. We recommend that journalists examine their own implicit biases and include a variety of voices across socioeconomic and different racial and cultural groups in writing such stories. We also invite news organizations to include discussion of the political and structural forces which shape substance use in structurally vulnerable communities. Additional recommendations for journalists include consulting best practice guidelines and websites that address existing myths about drug use, as well as suggestions on how to use person-first, non-stigmatizing language that is rooted in evidence. Advocates themselves are directed towards the strategies outlined in the previous slide and encouraged to consider ways to help raise the voices of Black and Indigenous partners in their advocacy work. In addition to a lack of diversity in our own group of participants, this study has a number of additional limitations. First of all, at the time that these interviews were conducted, there was a significant amount of media coverage taking place. And so views on media engagement likely varies with political and social context changing over time. As well, the experience of media advocacy might also vary for family members whose child's death was related to alcohol or stimulant use. And we also did not include in our research study the experience of fathers or siblings or husbands advocating, and that's an area that's important for future research as well. To conclude, our study illustrates an important and yet very complex relationship between bereaved mothers working to frame their advocacy messages in ways that will bring about long-term changes to Canada's drug policy landscape, and the journalists who are sharing their stories and messages through the news media with members of the Canadian public. This study was supported by a number of different awards and different sources of funding, and so we're incredibly grateful for that. We also want to extend our sincere thanks to all participants who took time and had the courage to share with us their stories of loss and advocacy with us. Additional thanks is extended to those members of the news media who continue to respectfully share family stories and support the advocacy efforts of everyone working to bring about sustainable drug policy reform. That is it for our presentation, and I think what I will do is I'll come out here, stop sharing my slides, and we're very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for your excellent and very impressive talk. I haven't noticed any comments in the chat so far, but I'm quite sure there will be questions coming up. So I think I'd ask everyone who has got a question, just write it briefly in the chat or put on your camera and unmute yourself. Since there are no questions here at the moment, I would take the privilege to ask the first question. And I was already wondering, you mentioned it, that of course other family members like fathers and siblings are also heavily impacted. And I understand that naming the group mothers is usually also the relationship we see most often when working with family members. But I just wonder about your ideas on how to better include other family members like fathers, siblings, and so on.
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you for that. What we frame ourselves as mothers and others. So we certainly we have a lot of spouses, siblings, children. It's predominantly women, and while we don't have any research evidence on that, I can speculate. One of the reasons is that it's predominantly the men who die. So the ones who gather are the ones who are left behind. 80% of those who die are men, and I would say 80 to 90% of those in our group who have lost someone have lost a son, a father, a husband, a brother, and then from judging from my own family, it is much harder. The way men are raised, the way masculinity is presented, you're not supposed to show weakness and such. And my husband has given 1 or 2 talks together with me, but he just finds it very difficult because at some point he might start to cry. And from being a little boy, he was told that men don't cry. And other fathers, that's why Phil is such a powerful exception. Other fathers have expressed that same. So we certainly, if we were to name the organization again, we would name it differently. There was a group in the US called Families for Evidence-Based Drug Policies. That I always like that name. It's maybe a little less emotional, and the emotional side of the name works. So yeah, right now that's the name we've got, but we certainly are making efforts to get more men included. We now have a man, even a very young one, on our board of directors, upcoming on our board of directors. So that is exciting. And so we are hoping to strengthen the male voice, but also the diverse voice. Another area we struggle with, which is very problematic, is that for people who are already marginalized, it is very, very difficult to speak about something that is as highly stigmatized as substance use. So while we have members who are part of visible minorities here in Canada, or who are Indigenous, Afro-Caribbean, Black, and such, most of those members come to us for support. Most of those members do not want to speak to the media because of the experience they've had. And that is a very, very difficult challenge that we continue to tackle, but a difficult challenge to overcome.
Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Richard, just another idea. I think we also did in one study a comparison of mothers and fathers and found certain different attachment styles as well. But also what I think, I really liked a lot what you said about the concept of codependency, and there are some brilliant papers from feminist psychological critique on the concept of codependency, because it stigmatizes traditional female role models. So I would recommend this to everyone, but Richard has got a question.
Well, I've got a number of questions and comments, actually, as you might expect, but I'm sure other people in the audience have as well. We have people, you cited Christine Berg Tilstad in your talk, and she's here, so I'm sure she's got things to say, and Jim Orford as well, and other people. But let me get a word in while I can. First, thank you for a really excellent high-level talk. I mean, I think you both presented marvelously. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, because I mean, certainly with one of you, that's what you've been doing for the last few years to a huge number of audiences. But it's a privilege that we could have both of you talk to us and for us to be your audience as well. It was really excellent. One of the things I wanted to ask about was that this is really a call for evidence-based policy. And your argument is that, quite rightly, that people who've been right at the forefront and people who are bereaved by bad policy or the results of bad policy need to advocate for change. But have you any evidence that there is any change happening? Do you think people are listening? One of the questions we often discuss within AFINet is, although we believe evidence-based policy is really important, most policymakers don't seem to want to listen to evidence. I'm not surprised that your experience was the first time that, or somebody's experience anyway, the first time that a politician would listen to them was when they knew they were going to be at a public event, and so they actually felt they did need to listen to them. It wasn't the evidence that they were interested in, it's the publicity component of it. And we've often discussed that members of parliament seem to make policy not because evidence is presented to them, but because single people write to them and they stand up in the House of Commons and say, I heard from one of my constituents today and this is what she said. So it's, I wonder, how do you feel that what you're doing is making a difference?
Heather, maybe you can talk about Cam's study, and I'll be just letting the puppies out for a second here.
Sure. No problem.
Sorry, hearing.
No problem. So you know, within Canada here, it's been so interesting because I started my PhD in 2016, and as Petra alluded to, that was when just prior to that, the Liberal federal government was elected, and they started to make available to the public the number of deaths that were happening in most jurisdictions across Canada. And so there has been a huge variety of different policy changes that have occurred in large part because of the fact that we've had a Liberal government in power at the federal level. And it's one of the things that just blew my mind when we interviewed these 43 women is many of them had not only written letters to politicians, but actually got a seat at the table where they've actually sat down, spoken. Some of them have spoken to our prime minister face to face. Many of them have spoken to premiers, ministers of health, also mayors of different cities. So there's a recognition that it's not just one level of government, but all levels of government that they've had to interact with. The other thing I would say in terms of one piece of evidence which has shown, I think, that we've come a fair ways since 2016 has been the fact that public support for safe supply, for public support for decriminalization, as well as public support for certain interventions such as supervised consumption sites have increased in most jurisdictions across Canada. And this is some of the research that I've been involved with a different group of people, is looking at public support for these initiatives. And that has definitely increased even from just 2019. Angus Reid has done some national public opinion polling. So we're starting to see that Canadians are starting to, with the education that they're receiving, but also probably connected to their own personal experience. We know that in Alberta, I think it's 41% have a connection to somebody, either themselves or personally, a personal connection, family or friend member who's been directly impacted by substance use. So all of those pieces, I think, play a part in terms of recognizing that there has been an impact. But again, you know, as mothers and fathers and everybody involved in this, whether you're researchers, whether you're government officials, will tell you that it's not just one person, it's a whole group of people all working together. And Petra can speak to this as well too, that as an advocacy organization, they're not working in isolation, that they're working very closely with other key stakeholders in terms of trying to put pressure on the different levels of government. Petra, do you have anything to add to that?
You stated that very well, and what we have learned, and one of the key messages is, don't try to change the mind of the politician. The politician will change their mind if you change the mind of their electorate. So we are really focused on changing the mind of the electorate. And here in our province, our hardline government is really out of sync on several issues, but they are out of sync with how people feel. And I sincerely hope that they're out of government next year so we can get more evidence-based policies again. So that is kind of our focus, changing the mind of the electorate. And our personal stories are so powerful in that. I always say we share our story to open hearts, because open hearts are more able to open minds and to the evidence. When people care, they're more prepared to listen.
Petra, I wonder if you could just also add, speak to the legal advocacy work that you've been engaged with as well.
Yeah.
So that's a really important piece as well too, that not too many people here might be aware of.
Yeah, when government does things that can harm people, one thing we have started to do is take them to court. And here in the province of Alberta, Mom Stop the Harm and the Lethbridge Overdose Prevention Society, we took our government to court. I signed that affidavit and I lost so much sleep. I did not wake up one morning thinking I want to take my government to court. It was really a last resort, but they implemented harmful regulations for consumption sites that create barriers to use, including the collection of health insurance numbers, where people should be able to get in low barrier and anonymous. So we are fighting that in court. We lost the ability to get an injunction, but our court case is still moving forward. We are also part of another court case where a group of people who use drugs filed a human rights case over decriminalization or over the criminalization of substance use. So we're using every avenue, legal and sometimes illegal. We partnered with a group of drug users in Vancouver, British Columbia, to give out tested and safe illegal substances to demonstrate that safe supply saves lives. They came like in a package. They were labeled keep away from children for percentages and such, label like a cigarette pack. So that was not legal, but done in a province where we weren't likely to be arrested. So we do whatever, we kind of expanded our advocacy from our early days in that regard.
That's really interesting, both of you. I have got a couple of subsidiary questions, but I'll ask them later because I see other people are queuing up, so I'll come back later. Thank you.
Yeah, so Christina has got a question or some.
Thank you, and thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm here together with my colleagues, or some of the researchers in the Norwegian research group that study bereaved family members and friends and help systems. And we have a lot of questions. We have, of course, read your article.
I've read all of your articles too.
And one of the PhD students is studying siblings, so she's very anxious to hear, is there any siblings that's working together with you? You mentioned moms and others, and are there any siblings there involved?
One of our board members is a sibling. We also have siblings leading support groups. We have grief support groups in person and online that are targeting siblings. And the sibling that is on our board, she also has a support group for people with loved ones still using. She's very actively involved. A lot of our members now have loved ones who are thankfully still alive. And this sibling is very active in supporting her brother through his journey. So we have some very, very active and engaged siblings in our group, which we're really thankful for, because our original group of moms, we are like a bunch of boomers. And today's technology can sometimes be very challenging to us. And since we are more of a volunteer organization, we depend on the children, our children who are involved in the advocacy, and the siblings to make sure that we are keeping up with the ways to get our message out. Mm.
So can she read more about it on any websites or anything? Do you have?
We don't have any, I don't recall any stories of siblings, John, but if anybody, you could give me send me an email and I could introduce, if you're interested in talking to Missy McLean, our board member who is a sibling, and also another board member, her daughter is very involved. I'd be happy to make an introduction to them and you could chat to them with them directly about their experience.
Oh, thank you for that. Could we have another question?
Of course.
Yeah. As you might know, Norway has a kind of Nordic welfare system. And when we read about the Canadians, we think you are pretty similar to us, but we're not that sure. And you mentioned that people or bereaved come to you for peer support. But how is it actually in Canada? Do the bereaved get psychosocial follow-up after losing a child or a sibling or a family member in general?
I got an envelope in the mail from court fines. We have victim services. So police has a group called Victim Services. And I got an envelope in the mail from Victim Services that included some services like for hospice and such, there's very little. But what our group find, if you are going to a grief group for bereaved parents, and there's a mom whose 5-year-old died of cancer, and your 25-year-old died from drug poisoning, there, even in a grieving community, there is a huge amount of stigma where people kind of look at you and kind of think, what have you done wrong for your child to die that way? So we find that our grief group, they're all peer support groups and not led by professional. We train and support peers, and it allows people to speak. We've never researched, we are now doing some scientific follow-up of our grief support group, but we have some informal survey, and some people have come forward and said, you've saved my life. You literally saved my life. And it's just being able to speak out and be honest about what you do. While our social and healthcare system is much better than in the US, it's a far cry from what you have. And I needed trauma care just to deal with everything and finding my child the way I did. And we paid, thankfully, my husband has a good enough job that we could pay for that privately. Even his Cadillac health plan didn't cover my trauma care.
Sounds like in Norway, but at least we got some social groups eventually the last couple of years. And my colleague Hilde here, she just published a study about helpers. So if you look her up, it was like last week. Yeah. So
global quality research, nursing research.
In global quality nursing research. So, but thank you very, very much. I'll let others ask their questions. Thank you.
And that recent paper is going to be listed amongst the papers when our next newsletter comes out. So yes, we're already aware of it.
I also have another question that came up because I'm always a bit ambivalent, about the use of the term evidence, because I think evidence most often isn't something which is 100% clear. Since I work with various professional organizations, and among these are also organizations who say best thing against a substance use problem is to stop the availability of them, which means to criminalize users and so on, blah blah blah. And I wonder, my impression was that one of the most important things you actually do is you give family members a face, and that it has got a lot to do with empathy and also ethical issues. You know, the way, how should we treat people who are marginalized or probably self-marginalize themselves? So it's rather a kind of humanitarian issue as well, which I personally, for example, in Lübeck, where I live, there is a large debate at the moment about starting a supervised consumption site, and everywhere where it's published, where there's a commentary function, you know, the first 10 people who write in say, well, don't spend money on that, it's their own fault, nobody needs to take drugs, blah blah. So I just wonder whether, first thing, there are also other groups that oppose your point of view from a more or less scientific point of view. And the other thing, what do you think about those more, ethical key issues regarding your work?
In terms of people opposing, I mean, our government here in Alberta, they've had 2 panels. They had one on supervised consumption sites and one on safe supply. And they say they're conducting a scientific review, but it was totally, the supervised consumption site review was totally debunked by a researcher, a criminologist from Halifax, and drawing a blank, Heather.
Livingston, Jamie Livingston.
Yeah, Jamie Livingston, that's right, Jamie Livingston. Please forgive me, Jamie, I remember you always. So what they present as science is not science. The science is squarely in support of supervised consumption site. Nobody has died there. They save money. They keep people healthy. They connect people to services. And often people just conflate what's the issue. The issue is, like here in Edmonton, people fight consumption sites because of the problems we have that are related to homelessness. If we were to give people housing, we wouldn't have these problems. You know, they say people defecate on the street, and they attribute that problem to the consumption site. But to me, it's a problem of not having a home and not having a toilet, not even having a public toilet. So we always push back by saying, what's the problem really? Where does the problem lie? And just keep driving home the evidence. But it's hard work to fight. It's kind of a narrative that in the war on drugs, we have been fed the same narrative. It's a choice, you know, just like you said earlier, codependency and drug use is a choice. It's really hard to fix societal issues. To repair the trauma Canada has done with residential school will take a huge effort. I mean, I'm German. I know what it took the nation to kind of deal with what Germany had done to Jewish people. That is something that I still feel guilty, and I'm a post-war generation. So it'll take a lot of time, but we have to start doing those kind of things, and it's difficult. It's much rather to blame the individual. You know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have choices to make choices. Or Indigenous people get so much money from the government, you know, and they just waste it on drugs. It's an easy out for politicians and an easy out for the public, because it abdicates all of us of our collective responsibilities, which we should really take seriously.
I just want to add one more thing to that too, is that sometimes as researchers in an academic environment, there's pressure on us not to get involved in advocacy, because people think that if you do that as a university researcher, that you're somehow biased, and that is not part of the role as a researcher. And yet I've been mentored myself by Dr. Rebecca Haynes-Saw, Dr. Elaine Hishka, other researchers who have taken quite a different approach and have worked collaboratively with the advocacy organizations that are trying to advance some of these policy initiatives. And it's been a great learning opportunity for myself, but I think something that we need to try to encourage more of younger researchers and people coming into graduate school, that this is an important part of your role in terms of working together to try to advance some of these policy reforms that are supported by research. So if we can lend a voice, whether it's through media interviews or speaking publicly at different public events and so forth, or sitting at the table with policy makers and politicians and so forth.
And now there's a question by Jim and another one by Richard, but I think I'll let Jim ask his question first.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jim Orford, England, University of Birmingham. Thank you both very, very much for your talk. It was, apart from anything else, it was a wonderful double act. I mean, double acts don't always don't always come off. They don't always work very well. Yours worked absolutely beautifully, I thought. So thank you very much for that. I've just got one little bit of information and then a question. My information is a group that I know very well in England at the moment is a group of family members who've been bereaved because of gambling related problems. Gambling with lives, they're called. You're nodding, Heather. Sounds as if you know them. I mean, there are lots of similarities to things you've said. I mean, I think the point you made about politicians, politicians sort of prick up their ears when they hear personal stories, and unfortunately, the more tragic the stories are, the more they prick up their ears. But politicians, I think, who are at all interested in gambling in Britain have been very influenced by gambling with lives. The only difference, I think, is that almost all young men, the people who've died, the main difference being that the deaths are, I think, all by suicide. That's the case of gambling. So, but my question is actually about, I think, Petra, something you said, you used the expression, I think you said any research project to be worthwhile. I think it was you that said that needs a knowledge translation project. And I'd really like to know a little bit about what you meant by that, because as a career researcher myself, I know only too well that we're brought up to be very cautious about the translation of research and drawing conclusions. We're trained to say things like, well, it could mean this, but on the other hand, it might mean that, and anyway, it's got this shortcoming and that shortcoming and another shortcoming to the research, and it needs replicating anyway. So we're brought up to be really cautious, which is really not terribly helpful in the real world. So I'm really interested to know what you meant by a knowledge translation project.
Of course, there's research where that might not apply, but in the research world that we do, every time you involve people with lived and living experience in your research, yes, we got a $50 gift card, but also I asked right in the beginning, what's in it for me? Will I see the results? Do we get to share the results? Do we get to learn from the results? We have learned from the results of the research. Some of our grief groups are sprang out of the result of the research, and we got government funding based on the research saying that people need grief support. People are harmed by not having grief support. And having the See Beyond project that helps reduce stigma, those kind of, it helps us do our work. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship with a researcher. They learn from us, but we also learn from them, and we use those learnings, and they come up with projects like the See Beyond project. In the last few minutes, I'd like to share a few words from another part of our research project where we looked at how people describe their loved ones, kind of to go beyond the numbers, those kind of things. But what you need to do when you start your research and you involve people with lived and living experience, you need to ask early on, what should your role be? What do you want your role to be? What do you want from me? Researchers are used to going to subjects and getting something from them, getting information. But you should also ask yourself what you can give people who participate in your research, and what you can do to help them further their work. Like our work is advocacy. So of course, we were hoping that the research will help us further our advocacy.
If you go to Mom Stop the Harm website, there's a tab at the top there called Research, and I believe so, right, Petra? And it's underneath that tab,
under Resources.
Under Resources, and then if you click on Research, that's where the final report that we wrote. We've written papers that have gone to published manuscripts, but we want to write a final report that we made available to all of the people that we interviewed, but also we sent it to government decision makers and other advocacy groups and so forth. So that's written in very plain language. It's got a lot of tables. It's geared not towards an academic community, but towards everyday people. And that's another example of knowledge translation output, or KT output. And the other thing I'll just quickly add too is the Tri-Council funding that we receive for research here in Canada. CIHR and SSHRC, Social Science Humanities Research Council, they put a tremendous emphasis nowadays on KT. So you are encouraged and expected to have actually a KT plan in the research that you're putting forward as well too. So that's something that's been really highly valued from the national funding bodies here in Canada for research.
Thank you.
So Richard also has raised his hand.
Well, I know that we need to finish quite quickly. We've been going on much longer than we thought we might, but that's because of the quality of the talk and the interest that what you've said. But I've just a couple of quick comments and a couple of quick questions. Comments. Firstly, it was just lovely to hear the interaction between you and Christine and the research group in Norway. You both know of each other, but you haven't actually met each other before. And that seems to me that's exactly what the Addiction and the Family International Network is all about. It's about networking people. So this was just a lovely example of networking people in Norway and people in Canada. And that's great. The second thing I wanted to reinforce what you said about the stigma of different types of grief. You know that we did research in the UK as well about people bereaved by substance use. And one of the things that many bereaved people told us was examples of going along to grief counselling groups and being told that their grief was different because the person who died of a alcohol or drug related problem or usage, it was their fault. They made the decision. Somebody else who was hit by a car or whatever, they were blameless. So the issue of blame comes in hugely, and the pecking order of grief. It's something which is, I think, quite a universal finding, and it's really quite tragic because the grief of a parent or of a partner or of a sibling is the same, irrespective of whether or not somebody took drugs or was hit by a car. My two questions are, firstly, it's lovely to hear that you've done a sort of final report for the users of the research, or the people who contributed to the research. But have you thought about publishing a toolkit between yourselves of how to do this? I mean, there are so many very excellent ideas about media advocacy and what the lessons you've learnt have been, and I would have thought a toolkit which could be widely available on, if this is what you're planning on doing, here are loads of tips, not just in your paper, you've got some headline tips, but more in-depth description about what some of those tips mean. I think that would be incredibly helpful to many other people in this position across the world. And my second question relates to you said that you've got peer-led support groups, and that the people who lead, the peer leaders, are trained. And I was interested in what training they received. I mean, many of the things that you said about not supporting codependency and tough love, but by wanting these groups to be empowering of affected family members, really mirrors exactly one of the evidence-based interventions that we support within AFINet, which is the 5-step method, and that's very much about empowering affected family members. So I just wondered what training you gave to your peer supporters.
Yeah. Thank you for the suggestion about the toolkit. It's something, Heather, we need to talk about with Elaine. Yeah. In terms of the training, we use a variety of tools. We get various speakers in. we make sure it's trauma informed. So we give a lot of information on trauma informed support, and that we give to the Holding Hope and to the Healing Heart groups. And I just popped their links in the chat. But in the Holding Hopes, we also we look at strategies that are more grounded in behavior modification. And there are a number of strategies and books that are available around that. So we also, I don't know if you have smart recovery groups, family support groups. We link people to smart recovery groups. So basically, yeah, looking at the evidence and mostly in cognitive behavior modification grounded theories is where we provide training to people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I hand back to you, Gallus.
Okay, I see also several people already had to leave, and there has been also some debate on the chat, but now we've already approached 90 minutes, so I would like to thank you very much again for your excellent talk and all the information provided, and I wish you a lot of success in your further work. And I'd also really welcome it if you could, for example, contribute something to the AFINet newsletter and stay in touch with us. We also have got a repository on the website, which might be helpful if you decide to develop a toolkit or whatever. So thank you very much. And to everyone who still remained here, I would like to remember that in 4 weeks, we'll have the next webinar, which will be about parental substance use, dynamics, parenting, and associations with child educational outcomes. And this and further webinars that are to come can be found on the AFINet website. So it would be good to check this regularly. And thank you very much. And thanks to all who participated in the discussion and who've been here, and others. I hope we'll have the opportunity to watch your presentation as it should have been recorded, which usually, well, gives more participants than the webinars themselves. So good, all the best for you. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you again in future webinars.
Yeah. Can I take half a minute to read some of the statements to close us?
Of
They're
course.
beyond numbers. Yeah. They were always there for me. He wanted to get married, was planning to go back to school, really, really loved football, competitor in a national trade competition, a knowledge keeper, loved his mama, held close in my heart still, tried many times to make it work, missed the most by her wife. His hero was Batman, a trained chef. I promised to always look after your kids. Fierce advocate for those she loved. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
And goodbye.
Best wishes and goodbye, and hope to see you again.